generally are on my side. For yourself, you have good friends in England, even among the greatest persons there. You have friends here, too, me in particular. As to me, my business is with literature. I confine myself to it as far as I can and keep aloof from other quarrels, but generally I think courtesy to opponents is more effective than violence. It might be wiser of you to denounce those who misuse the Pope's authority than to censure the Pope himself, so also with kings and princes. Old institutions cannot be rooted up in an instant. Quiet argument may do more than wholesale condemnation. Avoid all appearance of sedition. Keep cool. Do not get angry. Do not hate anybody. Do not be excited over the noise you have made. I have looked into your commentary on the Psalms, and I am much pleased with it. Christ give you his Spirit for his own glory and the world's good. Despite this cautious ambivalence, the theologians of Louvain continued to attack Erasmus as the fountainhead of the Lutheran flood. On October 8, 1520, Aleander arrived, posted the papal bull excommunicating Luther, and scored Erasmus as a secret fomenter of the revolt. The pundits accepted Aleander's lead and expelled Erasmus from the Louvain faculty on October 9, 1520. He moved to Cologne, and there, as we have seen, defended Luther in conference with Frederick of Saxony on November 5th. On December 5th, he sent to the elector a statement known as the Axiomata Erasmi, to effect that Luther's request to be tried by impartial judges was reasonable, that good men and lovers of the gospel were those who had taken least offense at Luther, that the world was thirsting for evangelical truth, that is, truth based solely on the gospel, and that such a mood so widely spread could not be suppressed. With the Dominican Johann Faber, he composed a memorial to Charles V, recommending that Charles, Henry VIII, and Louis II of Hungary should appoint an impartial tribunal to try Luther's case. In a letter to Cardinal Campeggio on December 6th, he urged justice for Luther. I perceived that the better a man was, the less he was Luther's enemy. A few persons only were clamoring at him in alarm for their own pockets. No one as yet answered him or pointed out his faults. How, while there are persons calling themselves bishops whose moral character is abominable, can it be right to persecute a man of unblemished life, in whose writings distinguished and excellent persons have found so much to admire? The object has been simply to destroy him and his books out of mind and memory, and it can only be done when he is proved wrong. If we want truth, every man ought to be free to say what he thinks without fear. If the advocates of one side are to be rewarded with mitres, and the advocates on the other with rope or stake, truth will not be heard. Nothing could have been more invidious or unwise than the Pope's bull. It was unlike Leo X, and those who were sent to publish it only made things worse. It is dangerous, however, for secular princes to oppose the papacy, and I am not likely to be braver than princes, especially when I can do nothing. The corruption of the Roman court may require reform, extensive and immediate, but I and the like of me are not called on to take a work like that upon themselves. I would rather see things left as they are than see a revolution that may lead to one knows not what. You may assure yourself that Erasmus has been and always will be a faithful subject of the Roman See. But I think, and many will think with me, that there would be a better chance of a settlement if there were less ferocity, if the management should be placed in the hands of men of weight and learning, if the Pope would follow his own disposition, and would not let himself be influenced by others. Luther made it more and more difficult for Erasmus to intercede for him, since with each month the violence of his speech increased, until in July 1520 he invited his readers to wash their hands in the blood of bishops and cardinals. When news came that Luther had publicly burned Leo's bull of excommunication, Erasmus confessed himself shocked. On January 15, 1521, the Pope sent him a letter expressing pleasure in his loyalty. At the same time, Leo sent instructions to Aleander to treat the humanist with every courtesy. As the Diet of Worms approached, a German prince asked Erasmus to come to Luther's help, but he replied that it was too late. He regretted Luther's refusal to submit. Such submission, he thought, would have furthered the movement for reform. Now he feared civil war. In February 1521, he wrote to a friend, "Everyone confessed that the Church suffered under the tyranny of certain men, and many were taking counsel to remedy this state of affairs. Now this man has arisen to treat the matter in such a way that no one dares to defend even what he has said well. 6 months ago I warned him to beware of hatred. The Babylonian captivity has alienated many from him, and he daily puts forth more atrocious things." Luther now abandoned hope of Erasmus's support and put him aside as a cowardly pacifist who thinks that all can be accomplished with civility and benevolence. At the same time, and despite Leo's instructions, Aleander and the Louvain theologians continued to attack Erasmus as a secret Lutheran. Disgusted, he moved to Basel on November 15, 1521, where he hoped to forget the young Reformation in the old Renaissance. Basel was the citadel of Swiss humanism. Here labored Beatus Renanus, who edited Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, discovered Velius Paterculus, and superintended the printing of Erasmus's New Testament. Here were printers and publishers who were also scholars, like Hans Amerbach and that saint among publishers, Johann Froben, or Frobenius, who wore himself out over his presses and texts, and, said Erasmus, left his family more honor than fortune. Here Dürer lived for years. Here Holbein made breathtaking portraits of Froben and Bonifacius Amerbach, who gathered the art collection now in the Basel Museum. 7 years before, on an earlier visit, Erasmus had described the circle with fond exaggeration. I seem to be living in some charming sanctuary of the Muses, where a multitude of learned persons appears as a matter of course. No one is ignorant of Latin, none of Greek. Most of them know Hebrew. This one excels in the study of history, that one is deeply versed in theology, one is skilled in mathematics, another is a student of antiquity, another is learned in the law. Certainly up to this time it has never been my good fortune to live in such an accomplished society. What a sincere friendship prevails among them all, what cheerfulness, what concord. Living with Froben, Erasmus acted as literary advisor, wrote prefaces, edited the Fathers. Holbein made famous portraits of him at Basel between 1523 and 1524. One is still there, another was sent to Archbishop Warham, and is now in the Earl of Radnor's collection. The third, in the Louvre, is Holbein's masterpiece. Standing at a table writing, wrapped in a heavy fur-trimmed coat, hooded with a beret covering half of each ear, the greatest of the humanists betrays in his premature age, he was now 57, the toll taken by ill health, a peripatetic life of controversy, and the spiritual loneliness and grief brought on by his attempt to be fair to both sides in the dogmatic conflicts of his time. Disheveled strays of white hair emerge from under the beret. Grim, thin lips, features refined but strong, a sharp ferreting nose, heavy eyelids almost closed on tired eyes. Here, in one of the greatest of all portraits, is the Renaissance slain by the Reformation. On December 1st, 1522, the new Pope, Adrian VI, wrote to Erasmus in terms suggestive of the extraordinary influence with which both sides credited him. It lies with you, God helping, to recover those who have been seduced by Luther from the right road, and to hold up those who still stand. I need not tell you with what joy I shall receive back these heretics without need to smite them with the rod of the imperial law. You know how far are such rough methods from my own nature. I am still as you knew me when we were students together. Come to me in Rome. You will find here the books which you will need. You will have myself and other learned men to consult with, and if you will do what I ask, you shall have no cause for regret. After a preliminary exchange of letters pledging each other to secrecy, Erasmus opened his heart to the Pope. Your Holiness requires my advice, and you wish to see me. I would go to you with pleasure if my health allowed. As to writing against Luther, I have not learning enough. You think my words will have authority. Alas, my popularity, such as I had, is turned to hatred. Once I was Prince of Letters, Star of Germany, High Priest of Learning, champion of a purer theology. The note is altered now. One party says I agree with Luther because I do not oppose him. The other finds fault with me because I oppose him. At Rome and in the Brabant I am called heretic, heresiarch, schismatic. I entirely disagree with Luther. They quote this and that to show we are alike. I could find 100 passages where St. Paul seems to teach the doctrines which they condemn in Luther. Those counsel you best to advise gentle measures. The monks, atlases they call themselves, of a tottering church, estrange those who would be its supporters. Some think there is no remedy but force. That is not my opinion. There would be frightful bloodshed. The question is not what heresy deserves, but how to deal with it wisely. For myself, I should say, discover the roots of the disease. Clean out those to begin with. Punish no one. Let what has taken place be regarded as a chastisement sent by Providence, and grant a general amnesty. If God forgives my sins, God's vicar may forgive. The magistrates may prevent revolutionary violence. If possible, there should be a check on the printing presses. Then let the world know and see what you mean in earnest to reform the abuses which are justly cried out against. If your holiness desires to know what are the roots to which I refer, send persons whom you can trust to every part of Latin Christendom. Let them consult the wisest men they can find in the different countries, and you will soon know. Poor Adrian, whose good intentions outran his powers, died broken-hearted in 1523. His successor, Clement VII, continued to urge Erasmus to enter the lists against Luther. When finally the scholar yielded, it was with no personal attack on Luther, no general indictment of the Reformation, but by an objective and mannerly discussion of free will. De libero arbitrio, 1524. He admitted that he could not fathom the mystery of moral freedom, nor reconcile it with divine omniscience and omnipotence, but no humanist could accept the doctrines of predestination and determinism without sacrificing the dignity and value of man or of human life. Here was another basic cleavage between the Reformation and the Renaissance. To Erasmus it seemed obvious that a God who punished sins that his creatures, as made by him, could not help committing, was an immoral monster unworthy of worship or praise. And to ascribe such conduct to Christ's Father in heaven would be the direst blasphemy. On Luther's assumptions, the worst criminal would be an innocent martyr, fated to sin by an act of God, and then condemned by divine vengeance to eternal suffering. How could a believer in predestination make any creative effort or labor to improve the condition of mankind? Erasmus confessed that a man's moral choice is fettered by 1,000 circumstances over which he has had no control. Yet man's consciousness persists in affirming some measure of freedom, without which he would be a meaningless automaton. In any case, Erasmus concluded, let us admit our ignorance, our incapacity to reconcile moral freedom with divine prescience or omnipresent causality. Let us postpone the solution to the Last Judgment. But meanwhile let us shun any hypothesis that makes man a puppet, and God a tyrant crueler than any in history. Clement VII sent Erasmus 200 florins, or about $5,000, on receiving the treatise. Most Catholics were disappointed by the conciliatory and philosophical tone of the book. They had hoped for an exhilarating declaration of war. Melanchthon, who had expressed predestinarian views in his Loci Communes, was favorably impressed by Erasmus's argument and omitted the doctrine in later editions. He, too, still hoped for peace. But Luther, in a delayed response entitled De Servo Arbitrio of 1525, defended predestination uncompromisingly. The human will is like a beast of burden. If God mounts it, it wishes and goes as God wills. If Satan mounts it, it wishes and goes as Satan wills. Nor can it choose its rider. The riders contend for its possession. God foresees, foreordains, and accomplishes all things by an unchanging, eternal, and efficacious will. By this thunderbolt, free will sinks shattered in the dust. It is significant of the 16th century mood that Luther rejected free will not, as some 18th century thinkers would do, because it ran counter to a universal reign of law and causality, nor, as many in the 19th century would do, because heredity, environment, and circumstance seemed to determine, like another trinity, the desires that seemed to determine the will. He rejected free will on the ground that God's omnipotence makes him the real cause of all events and all actions, and that consequently it is he, and not our virtue or our sins, who decides our salvation or damnation. Luther faces the bitterness of his logic manfully. Common sense and natural reason are highly offended that God, by his mere will, deserts, hardens, and damns, as if he delighted in sin and in such eternal torments, he who is said to be of such mercy and goodness. Such a concept of God seems wicked, cruel, and intolerable, and by it many men have been revolted in all ages. I myself was once offended to the very depth of the abyss of desperation, so that I wished that I had never been created. There is no use trying to get away from this by ingenious distinctions. Natural reason, however much it is offended, must admit the consequences of the omniscience and omnipotence of God. If it is difficult to believe in God's mercy and goodness when he damns those who do not deserve it, we must recall that if God's justice could be recognized as just by human comprehension, it would not be divine. Typical again of the age was the wide sale that this treatise on the slave will had in the 7 Latin and 2 vernacular editions that were called for within a year. In the sequel, this proved the great source book of Protestant theology. Here Calvin found the doctrine of predestination, election, and reprobation, which he transmitted to France, Holland, Scotland, England, and America. Erasmus answered Luther in 2 minor tracts, Hyperaspestes, the Defender, 1 and 2, from 1526 to 1527, but contemporary opinion gave the reformer the better of the argument. Even at this stage, Erasmus continued his efforts for peace. To his correspondence, he recommended tolerance and courtesy. He thought that the Church should permit clerical marriage and communion in both kinds, that she should yield some of her vast properties to lay authorities and uses, and that such divisive questions as predestination, free will, and the real presence should be left undefined, open to diverse interpretations. He advised Duke George of Saxony to treat the Anabaptists humanely. It is not just to punish with fire any error whatever, unless there be joined to it sedition or some other crime such as the laws punish with death. This was in 1524. In 1533, however, moved by friendship or senility, he defended the imprisonment of heretics by Thomas More. In Spain, where some humanists had become Erasmians, the monks of the Inquisition began a systematic scrutiny of Erasmus's works, with a view to having him condemned as a heretic, this in 1527. Nevertheless, he continued his criticism of monastic immorality and theological dogmatism as main provocatives of the Reformation. In 1528, he repeated the charge that many convents, both of men and women, are public brothels, and in many monasteries the last virtue to be found is chastity. In 1532, he condemned the monks as importunate beggars, seducers of women, hounders of heretics, hunters of legacies, forgers of testimonials. He was all for reforming the Church while deprecating the Reformation. He could not bring himself to leave the Church or to see her torn in half. "I endure the Church till the day I shall see a better one." He was dismayed when he heard of the sack of Rome by Protestant and Catholic troops in the service of the Emperor in 1527. He had hoped that Charles would encourage Clement to compromise with Luther. Now Pope and Emperor were at each other's throats. A closer shock came when, in a pious riot, the reformers at Basel destroyed the images in the churches in 1529. Only a year before, he himself had denounced the worship of images. The people should be taught that these are no more than signs. It would be better if there were none at all, and prayer were addressed only to Christ. But in all things let there be moderation. This was precisely on this point the position of Luther. But the incensed and senseless denudation of churches seemed to him an illiberal and barbarous reaction. He left Basel and moved to Freiburg im Breisgau, in Catholic Austrian territory. The city authorities received him with honors and gave him the unfinished palace of Maximilian I for a residence. When the imperial pension came too irregularly, the Fuggers sent him whatever funds he needed. But the monks and theologians of Freiburg attacked him as a secret skeptic and as the real cause of the turmoil in Germany. In 1535 he returned to Basel. A delegation of university professors went out to welcome him, and Jerome Froben, son of Johann, gave him rooms in his home. He was now 69, thin, with features drawn taut with age. He suffered from ulcers, diarrhea, pancreatitis, gout, stone, and frequent colds. Note the swollen hands in Dürer's drawing. In his final year he was confined to his rooms, often to his bed. Harassed with pain, and hearing almost daily of fresh attacks made upon him by Protestants and Catholics, he lost the habitual good cheer which had endeared him to his friends, and became morose. Yet, almost daily, letters of homage came to him from kings, prelates, statesmen, scholars, or financiers, and his dwelling was a goal of literary pilgrimage. On June 6, 1536, he was stricken with acute dysentery. He knew himself to be dying, but did not ask for a priest or confessor, and passed away on June 12th without the sacraments of the Church, repeatedly invoking the names of Mary and Christ. Basel gave him a princely funeral and a tomb in the cathedral. The humanists, the printers, and the bishop of the city joined in erecting over his remains a stone slab, still in place, commemorating his incomparable erudition in every branch of learning. His will left no legacy for religious purposes, but assigned sums for the care of the sick or the old, for providing dowries for poor girls, and for the education of promising youths. His standing with posterity fluctuated with the prestige of the Renaissance. Almost all parties, in the fever of religious revolution, called him a trimmer and a coward. The reformers charged him with having led them to the brink, inspired them to jump, and then taken to his heels. At the Council of Trent he was branded an impious heretic, and his works were forbidden to Catholic readers. As late as 1758, Horace Walpole termed him a begging parasite who had parts enough to discover the truth and not courage enough to profess it. Late in the 19th century, as the smoke of battle cleared, a learned and judicious Protestant historian mourned that the Erasmian conception of reform, a scholar's conception, was soon interrupted and set aside by ruder and more drastic methods. Yet it may be questioned whether, after all, the slow way is not in the long run the surest, and whether any other agent of human progress can permanently be substituted for culture. The Reformation of the 16th century was Luther's work, but if any fresh Reformation is coming, it can only be based on the principles of Erasmus. And the Catholic historian adds an almost rationalistic appreciation. Erasmus belonged intellectually to a later and more scientific and rational age. The work which he had initiated, and which was interrupted by the Reformation troubles, was resumed at a more acceptable time by the scholarship of the 17th century. Luther had to be, but when his work was done and passion cooled, men would try again to catch the spirit of Erasmus and the Renaissance, and renew in patience and mutual tolerance the long, slow labor of enlightenment. Chapter 20. The Faiths at War, 1526 to 1560. 1. The Protestant Advance, 1525 to 1530. What combination of forces and circumstances enabled nascent Protestantism to survive the hostility of both papacy and empire? Mystical piety, biblical studies, religious reform, intellectual development, Luther's audacity were not enough. They might have been diverted or controlled. Probably the economic factors were decisive. The desire to keep German wealth in Germany, to free Germany from papal or Italian domination, to transfer ecclesiastical property to secular uses, to repel imperial encroachments upon the territorial, judicial, and financial authority of the German princes, cities, and states. Add certain political conditions that permitted the Protestant success. The Ottoman Empire, after conquering Constantinople and Egypt, was expanding dangerously in the Balkans and Africa, absorbing half of Hungary, besieging Vienna, and threatening to close the Mediterranean to Christian trade. Charles V and Archduke Ferdinand required a united Germany and Austria, Protestant as well as Catholic money and men, to resist this Moslem avalanche. The emperor was usually engrossed in the affairs of Spain or Flanders or Italy, or in mortal conflict with Francis I of France. He had no time or funds for civil war in Germany. He agreed with his pensioner Erasmus that the Church badly needed reform. He was intermittently at odds with Clement VII and Paul III, even to allowing his army to sack Rome. Only when emperor and pope were friends could they effectually combat the religious revolution. But by 1527, the Lutheran heresy had become orthodoxy in half of Germany. The cities found Protestantism profitable. "They do not care in the least about religion," mourned Melanchthon. "They are only anxious to get dominion into their hands, to be free from the control of the bishops." For a slight alteration in their theological garb, they escaped from episcopal taxes and courts, and could appropriate pleasant parcels of ecclesiastical property. Yet an honest desire for a simpler and sincerer religion seems to have moved many citizens. At Magdeburg, the members of St. Ulrich's parish met in the churchyard and chose 8 men who were to select the preacher and manage the affairs of the church. This in 1524. Soon all churches in the city were administering the Lord's Supper in the Lutheran mode. Augsburg was so fervently Protestant that when Campeggio came there as papal legate, the populace dubbed him Antichrist. This also in 1524. Most of Strasbourg accepted the new theology from Wolfgang Fabricius Capito in 1523, and Martin Butzer, who succeeded him there, also converted Ulm. In Nuremberg, great business leaders like Lazarus Spengler and Hieronymus Baumgärtner won the city council to the Lutheran creed in 1526. The Sebalduskirche and the Lorenzkirche transformed their ritual accordingly, while keeping their Catholic art. In Brunswick, the writings of Luther were widely circulated. His hymns were publicly sung. His version of the New Testament was so earnestly studied that when a priest misquoted it, he was corrected by the congregation. Finally, the city council ordered all clergymen to preach only what could be found in the Scriptures, to baptize in German, and to serve the sacrament in both forms. This in 1528. By 1530, the new faith had won Hamburg, Bremen, Rostock, Lübeck, Stralsund, Danzig, Dorpat, Riga, Reval, and almost all the imperial cities of Swabia. Iconoclastic riots broke out in Augsburg, Hamburg, Brunswick, Stralsund. Probably some of this violence was a reaction against the ecclesiastical use of statues and paintings to inculcate ridiculous and lucrative legends. The princes, gladly adopting Roman law, which made the secular ruler omnipotent as delegate of the sovereign people, saw in Protestantism a religion that not only exalted the state but obeyed it. Now they could be spiritual as well as temporal lords, and all the wealth of the Church could be theirs to administer or enjoy. John the Steadfast, who succeeded Frederick the Wise as Elector of Saxony in 1525, definitely accepted the Lutheran faith, which Frederick had never done, and when John died in 1532, his son John Frederick kept electoral Saxony firmly Protestant. Philip the Magnanimous, Landgrave of Hesse, formed with John the League of Gotha and Torgau in 1526 to protect and extend Lutheranism. Other princes fell in line: Ernest of Lüneburg, Otto and Francis of Brunswick-Lüneburg, Henry of Mecklenburg, Ulrich of Württemberg. Albert of Prussia, Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, followed Luther's advice, abandoned his monastic vows, married, secularized the lands of his order, and made himself Duke of Prussia in 1525. Luther saw himself, apparently by the mere force of his personality and eloquence, winning half of Germany. Since many monks and nuns now left their convents and the public seemed unwilling to support the remainder, the Lutheran princes suppressed all monasteries in their territory except a few whose inmates had embraced the Protestant faith. The princes agreed to share the confiscated properties and revenues with the nobles, the cities, and some universities, but this pledge was very laxly redeemed. Luther inveighed against the application of ecclesiastical wealth to any but religious or educational purposes, and condemned the precipitate seizure of church buildings and lands by the nobility. A modest part of the spoils was yielded to schools and poor relief. The princes and nobles kept the rest. Under cover of the gospel, wrote Melanchthon in 1530, the princes were only intent on the plunder of the churches. For good or evil, for spiritual or material ends, the great transformation progressed. Whole provinces, East Friesland, Silesia, Schleswig, Holstein, went over almost unanimously to Protestantism. Nothing could better show how moribund Catholicism had there become. Where priests survived, they continued their support of concubines and clamored for permission to marry legally as the Lutheran clergy were doing. Archduke Ferdinand reported to the Pope that the desire for marriage was almost universal among the Catholic secular clergy, that out of 100 pastors, scarcely one was not openly or secretly married. And Catholic princes pleaded with the papacy that the abolition of celibacy had become a moral necessity. A loyal Catholic complained in 1524 that the bishops, with revolution on their doorsteps, went on with their Lucullan feasts. And the Catholic historian, speaking of Albrecht, Archbishop of Mainz, describes the luxuriously furnished apartments which this unholy prince of the Church used for secret intercourse with his mistress. Everybody, says the same historian, had become so hostile to priests that these were mocked and annoyed wherever they went. The people everywhere, wrote Erasmus on January 31, 1530, are for the new doctrines. This was true, however, only in northern Germany, and even there Duke George of Saxony and Elector Joachim of Brandenburg were resolutely Catholic. Southern and western Germany, which had been part of the ancient Roman Empire and had received some Latin culture, remained for the most part loyal to the Church. The gemütlich South preferred the gaily colorful and sexually lenient ways of Catholicism to the predestinarian stoicism of the North. The powerful elector archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and, till 1543, Cologne, kept their regions predominantly Catholic. And Pope Adrian VI saved Bavaria by granting its dukes, for their secular uses, a fifth of ecclesiastical income in their state. A similar grant of church revenues appeased Ferdinand in Austria. Hungary entered vitally into the drama. The premature accession of Louis II at the age of 10 in 1516, and his premature death, were formative elements in the Hungarian tragedy. Even his birth was premature. The medicos of his time barely saved the frail infant by enclosing it in the warm carcasses of animals slaughtered to give it heat. Louis grew into a handsome youth, kindly and generous, but given to extravagance and festivities on meager resources amid a corrupt and incompetent court. When Sultan Suleiman sent an ambassador to Buda, the nobles refused to receive him, dragged him around the country, cut off his nose and ears, and turned him back to his master. The infuriated Sultan invaded Hungary and seized two of its most vital strongholds, Szabadka and Belgrade, in 1521. After long delays and amid the treason or cowardice of his nobles, Louis raised an army of 25,000 men and marched out with mad heroism to face 100,000 Turks on a field near Mohacs on August 30, 1526. The Hungarians were slaughtered almost to a man, and Louis himself was drowned in stumbling flight. Suleiman entered Buda in triumph. His army sacked and burned the handsome capital, destroyed all its major buildings except the royal palace, and gave to the flames most of Matthias Corvinus's precious library. The victorious host spread over the eastern half of Hungary, burning and pillaging, and Suleiman drove 100,000 Christian captives before him to Constantinople. The surviving magnates divided into hostile factions. One group, judging resistance impossible, chose John Zapolya as king and authorized him to sign a submissive peace. Suleiman allowed him to reign in Buda as his vassal, but the eastern half of Hungary remained in effect under Turkish domination till 1686. Another faction united with the nobles of Bohemia to give the crown of both Hungary and Bohemia to Ferdinand, in the hope of securing the aid of the Holy Roman Empire and the powerful Habsburg family. When Suleiman returned to the attack in 1529, marching 135 miles from Buda along the Danube to the gates of Vienna, Ferdinand successfully defended his capital. But during those critical years, Charles V had been forced to humor the Protestants, lest all Europe should fall to Islam. The westward advance of the Turks so obviously protected Protestantism that Philip of Hesse rejoiced at Turkish victories. When Suleiman, balked at Vienna, returned to Constantinople, Catholics and Protestants were free to renew their struggle for the soul of Germany. 2. The Diets disagree, 1526 to 1541. As internal liberty varies, other things equal, with external security, Protestantism, during its safe period, indulged in the sectarian fragmentation that seemed inherent in the principles of private judgment and the supremacy of conscience. Already in 1525, Luther wrote, "There are nowadays almost as many sects and creeds as there are heads." Melanchthon was kept grievously busy moderating his master and finding ambiguous formulas for reconciling contradictory certitudes. Catholics pointed gleefully to the mutually recriminating Protestant factions and predicted that freedom of interpretation and belief would lead to religious anarchy, moral disintegration, and a skepticism abominable to Protestants as well as Catholics. In 1525, 3 artists were banished from Protestant Nuremberg for questioning the divine authorship of the Bible, the real presence in the Eucharist, and the divinity of Christ. While Suleiman was preparing the campaign that cut Hungary in half, a diet of German princes, prelates, and burghers met at Speyer in June of 1526 to consider the demands of the Catholics that the Edict of Worms should be enforced, and the counter-proposal of the Protestants that religion be left free until a general council under German auspices should adjudicate the disputes. The Protestants prevailed, and the concluding decree of this diet ruled that, pending such a council, each German state, in religion, should so live, rule, and bear itself as it thought it could answer to God and the Emperor, that no one should be punished for past offenses against the Edict of Worms, and that the word of God should be preached by all parties, none interfering with the others. The Protestants interpreted this recess of Speyer as sanctioning the establishment of Lutheran churches, the religious autonomy of each territorial prince, and the prohibition of the Mass in Lutheran areas. The Catholics rejected these assumptions, but the Emperor, embroiled with the Pope, accepted them for the time being, and Ferdinand was soon too busy with affairs in Hungary to make any effectual resistance. Having made his peace with Clement, Charles returned to the natural conservatism of a king and ordered the Diet of Speyer to reconvene on February 1st, 1529. Under the influence of the presiding Archduke and the absent Emperor, the new assembly repealed the recess of 1526 and passed a decree permitting Lutheran services, but requiring the toleration of Catholic services in Lutheran states, completely forbidding Lutheran preaching or ritual in Catholic states, enforcing the Edict of Worms, and outlawing Zwinglian and Anabaptist sects everywhere. On April 25, 1529, the Lutheran minority published a protest, declaring that conscience forbade their acceptance of this decree. They appealed to the Emperor for a general council. Meanwhile, they would adhere to the original recess of Speyer at whatever cost. The term Protestant was applied by the Catholics to the signers of this protest, and gradually came into use to designate the German rebels from Rome. Still needing German unity against the Turks, Charles called another diet, which met at Augsburg on June 20, 1530, under his presidency. During this conference he stayed with Anton Fugger, now head of the firm that had made him emperor. According to an old story, the banker pleased the ruler by lighting a fire with an imperial certificate of indebtedness. As the Fuggers were financially allied with the popes, the gesture may have moved Charles a step nearer to the papacy. Luther did not attend, for he was still under the imperial ban and might at any moment be arrested. But he went to Coburg on the Saxon border and kept in touch through messengers with the Protestant delegation. He compared the assembly to a congregation of jackdaws that chattered and maneuvered before his windows, and he complained that each bishop brought as many devils, or voters, to the diet as there are fleas on a dog on St. John's Day. It was apparently at this time that he composed the greatest of his hymns, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God. On June 24th, Cardinal Campeggio appealed to the Diet for the utter suppression of the Protestant sects. On the 25th, Christian Speyer read to the Emperor and a portion of the Assembly the famous Augsburg Confession, which Melanchthon had prepared, and which, with some modifications, was to become the official creed of the Lutheran churches. Partly because he feared a war of the combined imperial and papal forces against the divided Protestants, partly because he was by temperament inclined to compromise and peace, Melanchthon gave the statement, says a Catholic scholar, a dignified, moderate, and pacific tone, and strove to minimize the differences between the Catholic and Lutheran views. He expatiated on the heresies that the evangelicals, as the Lutherans called themselves from their sole reliance on the Gospels or the New Testament, and the Roman Catholics alike condemned. He dissociated the Lutheran from the Zwinglian reform and left the latter to shift for itself. He softened the doctrines of predestination, consubstantiation, and justification by faith. He spoke temperately of the ecclesiastical abuses that Protestantism had abated. He defended with courtesy the administration of the sacrament in both forms, the abolition of monastic vows, the marriage of the clergy. And he appealed to Cardinal Campeggio to accept this confession in the conciliatory spirit in which it had been composed. Luther regretted some of the concessions, but gave the document his indispensable approval. Zwingli sent his own Ratio Fidei to the Emperor, frankly stating his disbelief in the real presence. Strasbourg, Constance, Lindau, and Memmingen presented a separate confession, the Tetrapolitana, in which Capito and Butzer struggled to bridge the gaps among the Lutheran, Zwinglian, and Catholic creeds. The extreme faction of the Catholics, led by Eck, retorted with a confutation so intransigent that the Assembly refused to submit it to the Emperor until it had been twice toned down. So revised, it insisted on transubstantiation, 7 sacraments, the invocation of saints, clerical celibacy, communion in bread alone, and the Latin Mass. Charles approved this confutation and declared that the Protestants must accept it or face war. A milder party of Catholics entered into negotiation with Melanchthon and offered to permit communion in bread and wine. Melanchthon, in turn, agreed to recognize auricular confession, fasts, episcopal jurisdiction, even, with some provisos, the authority of the popes. But the other Protestant leaders refused to go so far. Luther protested that the restoration of episcopal jurisdiction would subject the new ministers to the Roman hierarchy and would soon liquidate the Reformation. Seeing agreement impossible, several Protestant princes left for their homes. On November 19th, the diminished Diet issued its final recess or decree. All phases of Protestantism were condemned. The Edict of Worms was to be enforced. The Imperial Chamber of Justice was to start legal actions against all appropriators of ecclesiastical property. The Protestants were to have until April 15, 1531, to accept the confutation peaceably. Charles's signature made this recess of Augsburg an imperial decree. To the emperor it must have seemed the height of reasonableness to give the rebels 6 months to adjust themselves to the will of the Diet. Within that period he offered them immunity from the Edict of Worms. Thereafter, if other duties would allow, he might have to submit the rival theologies to the Supreme Court of War. While the Diet was yet in session, several states formed a Catholic League for the defense and restoration of the traditional faith. Interpreting this as a martial gesture, Protestant princes and cities organized in March 1531 the Schmalkaldic League, which took its name from its birthplace near Erfurt. When the period of grace ran out, Ferdinand, now King of the Romans, proposed to Charles to begin war. But Charles was not yet ready. Suleiman was planning another attack upon Vienna. Suleiman's confederate, Barbarossa, was raiding Christian commerce in the Mediterranean, and Suleiman's ally, Francis of France, was waiting to pounce upon Milan the moment Charles became involved in a German civil war. In April 1531, instead of enforcing the Augsburg decree, he suspended it and asked for Protestant aid against the Turks. Luther and the princes responded loyally. Lutherans and Catholics signed the Peace of Nuremberg on July 23, 1532, pledging united aid to Ferdinand and mutual religious toleration until a general council should be convened. So numerous an army of Protestant and Catholic Germans, of Spanish and Italian Catholics, gathered under the emperor's standard at Vienna that Suleiman found the omens unfavorable and turned back to Constantinople, while the Christian army, drunk with its bloodless victory, plundered Christian towns and homes, spreading greater disaster, said eyewitness Thomas Cranmer of England, than the Turks themselves. The patriotism of the Protestants gave their movement new dignity and impetus. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.